for the Lakota people and the other tribes in the area having to look up and see the faces of these colonizers. Nationally, there's this conversation around, what is white supremacy and how does it manifest? How does it show up? And how has white supremacy as it pertains to Indigenous people been so normalized that we've been taught to look past it? And so it was evident there in the resistance to understand why this is a symbol of white supremacy, that white supremacy and colonization have been so normalized and accepted that the vast majority of America can't really see past that. That white supremacy or racism when it comes to Indigenous people have a hard time accepting that that's what it is. It is white supremacy.
Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. And they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage.
Between 1927 and 1941, 400 workers blasted 450,000 tons of rock from a mountainside using chisels, jackhammers, and a lot of dynamite. Gradually, they carved out Mount Rushmore. Now, the monument draws nearly 3 million people to South Dakota's Black Hills every year. But its facade belies a dark history. About 10,000 years ago, Native American people began inhabiting the Black Hills. The area became especially sacred to the Lakota people, who formed the western branch of what the U.S. called the Sioux Nation. The Lakota believed one cave within the Black Hills to be where they first emerged, and they named one of the Black Hills mountain peaks the Six Grandfathers, after their sacred directional spirits. But in the 1800s, Lakota access to this land came under threat. White settlers in North America expanded their territories by using physical violence or negotiating with indigenous peoples. After its establishment in the late 1700s, the U.S. government ratified hundreds of treaties with Native American nations. However, it often broke them or created them using coercion. Between 1866 and 1868, the Lakota and their allies successfully defended their land from the U.S. military and negotiated a new treaty with the government. In the 1868 treaty at Fort Laramie, all parties agreed that a vast territory, including the Black Hills, belonged to the Sioux Nation. In return, the Lakota would allow U.S. travelers to pass safely through. But many aspects of the treaty also aimed to assimilate the Lakota into white culture. This included incentives to convert them from hunting to farming, abandon their nomadic lifestyle, and wear clothes the U.S. provided. Meanwhile, just 7 years later, the U.S. broke the treaty after an expedition found gold in the Black Hills. Miners set up camps, the military attacked and ultimately defeated the Lakota, and the U.S. passed legislation illegally seizing the land. 50 years later, workers began etching into the Lakota's sacred Six Grandfathers Mountain. The project was led by an arrogant sculptor named Gutzon Borglum, who had ties to the KKK. A historian originally proposed that Mount Rushmore include Western figures, like Lakota chief Red Cloud, but Borglum chose to feature his own heroes. By October of 1941, Borglum had died from surgical complications and work stopped, though the project was unfinished. None of the 4 figures had torsos as intended, and rubble was left piled below. To the Lakota, the monument was a desecration, and the presidents immortalized on the rock face all had brutal anti-indigenous legacies. Members of the Iroquois Confederacy called George Washington Town Destroyer for encouraging military campaigns that burned 50 of their villages in 1779. Theodore Roosevelt championed forced assimilation and said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are." In 1980, after the Sioux Nation had sued the U.S. for treaty violations, the Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been unlawfully taken, and the Sioux were entitled to compensation. The amount named has since reached over $1 billion, but the Sioux Nation refused to take the money and give up their claim to the Black Hills, maintaining that they were never for sale. So, what should happen to Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills? Responses to that question are wide-ranging. Some, including tribal leaders and Borglum's great-granddaughter, have called for Mount Rushmore to be removed. Others see it as an important patriotic symbol and vital aspect of South Dakota's economy that should remain. Many Lakota people want the 1868 treaty to be honored and the now federally controlled lands to be returned to their tribal communities. Others have said that the Lakota and the U.S. should at least co-manage parts of the Black Hills. Currently, there are no plans for change. The U.S. broke many of its promises with indigenous nations, making issues like this common. Native people have been fighting for broken treaties to be honored for generations.
He hath put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords.
Because of unrighteous dealings, injuries, and riches got by deceit, the kingdom is translated from one people to another.
We came here and created a blank slate. We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, that there isn't much Native American culture in American culture. There isn't much Native American culture in American culture. There isn't much Native American culture in American culture.